My name is Chloe. I am 29 years old. Yesterday morning, a courier delivered a hostile legal threat to my Seattle office. It was a demand from Hastings Manufacturing, a massive industrial conglomerate, ordering my company to surrender our most valuable patent immediately or face total legal destruction. They threatened to bury my firm in endless litigation. They promised financial ruin. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They had absolutely no idea that the anonymous CEO they were trying to intimidate was the 11-year-old daughter they threw away like garbage 18 years ago. Before I tell you how I used their own arrogance to completely dismantle their empire, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you love seeing true justice served. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. Now let me take you back to the moment the past showed up on my desk. The rain was coming down hard against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office in downtown Seattle. The sky was a heavy, bruised gray. It perfectly matched the mood in the room as I sat behind my mahogany desk, staring at the thick stack of legal documents resting on my blotter. The paper was heavy and expensive, the kind law firms used to intimidate smaller businesses. The letterhead belonged to one of the most ruthless corporate litigation firms on the West Coast. But it was the names at the bottom of the cease and desist order that made the air in my lungs turn to ice. Richard Hastings, Chief Executive Officer, and Claire Hastings, Chief Operating Officer, my father and my twin sister. I am a forensic accountant by trade. I spend my days tracing hidden assets, uncovering corporate fraud, and finding the money people desperately try to hide. 3 years ago, I inherited this intellectual property holding firm from my late Uncle Thomas. Thomas was a brilliant, gritty, self-made man who taught me everything I know about business and survival. He spent decades acquiring and protecting patents. When he passed away, he left the entire firm to me. I deliberately kept my name off the public-facing executive roster. On professional networking sites, I simply list myself as a lead accountant. I prefer to operate in the shadows. It gives me a tactical advantage. It allows me to see how people behave when they think no one important is watching. And right now, my biological family was behaving like desperate cornered animals. I leaned forward and read through their hostile demand for the 4th time. Hastings Manufacturing was drowning. I did not need to see their internal ledgers to know it. The clues were buried right there in their own legal threats. Recent Federal Environmental Protection Agency regulations had completely outlawed the core chemical compounds they used in their primary manufacturing line. Their factories were facing massive daily fines. Their supply chains were frozen. They were weeks, maybe days away from federal indictment and total bankruptcy. There was exactly one legal alternative on the market that could save their product line and keep their factories running. A proprietary chemical formula called EcoBond. It was a revolutionary, non-toxic industrial adhesive that perfectly replaced the banned materials without slowing down assembly lines. And my firm owned the exclusive patent for EcoBond. They did not approach my company with a respectful offer to negotiate a licensing deal. That was not the Hastings way. Instead, they sent a demand letter filled with aggressive legal jargon. They claimed my firm was monopolizing a crucial industrial resource. They threatened to file an antitrust lawsuit if I did not immediately surrender the licensing rights to Hastings Manufacturing for a fraction of what the patent was actually worth. They thought they were bullying a small, faceless LLC. They assumed their big name and their high-priced lawyers would terrify some mid-level manager into handing over the keys to the kingdom. They thought they held all the power. But as my eyes traced the bottom of the final page, all the corporate noise faded away. My focus locked onto a single detail: the signature. Richard Hastings. The ink was dark blue. The R was sharp and aggressive. The loops of the H were overly large, dominating the space around it. The tail of the S dragged down like a whip. It was a signature designed to take up space, a signature that demanded to be seen as important. My hands began to tremble. I dropped the heavy parchment onto my desk and pressed my palms flat against the cool wood, trying to ground myself. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath, but the smell of the Seattle rain outside my window vanished. Suddenly, I was not a 29-year-old CEO sitting in a high-rise office. I was 11 years old again, standing in a narrow hallway in Portland, smelling the sharp scent of floor wax and my mother's expensive floral perfume. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. 18 years vanished in a single heartbeat. I was 11. I was standing in the foyer of the massive Hastings family home. At my feet were two black plastic garbage bags. They contained everything I owned in the world. A few pairs of jeans, some faded t-shirts, a worn-out stuffed bear, and a math workbook that I had cried over the night before. In the Hastings household, love was not a right. It was an investment, and I was considered a failing asset. My twin sister Claire was the golden child. She was the prodigy. By age 11, she was playing the violin in regional competitions. She brought home straight A report cards. She spoke with a polished vocabulary that made my parents beam with pride at country club dinners. She was exactly what Richard and Patricia Hastings wanted. A shiny trophy they could show off to their wealthy friends. A perfect heir to the Hastings empire. I was the opposite. I struggled with undiagnosed ADHD. I could not sit still in a classroom. I had to read the same paragraphs 4 times before the words made sense. Math equations looked like scrambled puzzles to me. While Claire was praised as a genius, I was openly called a distraction, a disappointment, a financial drain. I remembered the exact moment they decided they were done with me. We were sitting at the long mahogany dining table. Claire was showing off a ribbon she had won at a science fair. I knocked over a glass of water, reaching for the salt. It shattered on the hardwood floor. My mother, Patricia, stood up, her face tight with disgust. She did not ask if I was cut. She did not help me clean it up. She just looked at my father and said, "I cannot do this anymore, Richard. She is ruining Claire's environment. We need to cut our losses. Cut our losses." That is how they spoke about their own child. 2 days later, the black garbage bags were sitting by the front door. My mother did not even come downstairs to say goodbye. She stayed in the upstairs sitting room helping Claire practice her violin. The music drifted down the stairs light and airy, mocking the heavy dread settling in my stomach. My father stood by the front door holding a manila folder. He did not look angry. He looked entirely indifferent, which was somehow so much worse. He looked like a man taking out the trash. We drove for 3 hours in complete silence. We crossed the state line into Washington, heading toward a gritty working-class neighborhood in Seattle. My father parked his luxury sedan in front of a small faded house with peeling paint and a sagging front porch. This was where his older brother Thomas lived. Uncle Thomas was the black sheep of the Hastings family. He was a self-taught accountant who lived simply and refused to participate in my father's pretentious social climbing. They had not spoken in 5 years. Uncle Thomas opened the door, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He looked at my father, then down at me and the 2 garbage bags. My father handed Thomas a sealed envelope. "There is a check in there," my father said, his voice flat and businesslike. "It will cover her expenses for the year. The legal papers are signed. She is your problem now." Uncle Thomas opened the folder. I watched him pull out the documents. I did not know what they were at the time. I did not understand the heavy legal terms. Voluntary relinquishment of parental rights, transfer of legal guardianship. I just watched my father pull a pen from his breast pocket and sign the bottom line right there on the porch. I watched the dark blue ink flow onto the paper. I watched the sharp, aggressive R, the overly large loops of the H, the heavy, dragging tail of the S. Richard Hastings. He handed the clipboard to Thomas, turned around, and walked back to his car. He did not hug me. He did not say he loved me. He did not even look back as he pulled away from the curb and drove out of my life, leaving me standing on a strange porch with my belongings stuffed into trash bags. I blinked hard, forcing the memory away, and the polished mahogany of my Seattle office came back into focus. The rain was still drumming against the glass. The air conditioning hummed quietly in the background. The panic that had gripped my chest slowly dissolved, replaced by a cold, brilliant clarity. I looked down at the cease and desist letter again. The signature was identical. 18 years had not changed the arrogant strokes of my father's handwriting. He was the exact same man who had abandoned his 11-year-old daughter to save his own convenience. But I was not the same girl. Uncle Thomas had not looked at me with pity that day. He had carried my bags inside, set me down at his kitchen table, and handed me a calculator. He told me that tears would not pay the bills, but numbers never lied. Over the next decade and a half, he poured his life into me. He realized my ADHD was not a defect. It was a superpower when channeled correctly. I did not think in straight lines. I saw patterns. I could look at a massive chaotic spreadsheet and instantly spot the anomalies. He taught me forensic accounting. He taught me how to read the hidden stories in corporate ledgers. He taught me how to build silent wealth, piece by piece, patent by patent, away from the greedy eyes of people like my father. Thomas gave me the tools to build armor made of ironclad contracts and financial independence. He left me his legacy, and now the very people who threw me away were standing at my gates, demanding I hand over the keys. I reached out and ran my fingers over the expensive paper of the legal threat. They were bleeding cash. They were drowning in EPA violations. Claire, the supposed business genius, had clearly steered their ship straight into an iceberg. And now they were trying to steal the lifeboats from a company they thought was small and weak. They wanted a war. They wanted to use the legal system to crush me and take what was mine. A slow smile spread across my face. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of an apex predator watching its prey walk willingly into a trap. I picked up my desk phone and pressed the speed dial for my lead corporate attorney. He answered on the first ring. "Good morning, Chloe," he said. "Did you receive the package from Hastings Manufacturing?" "I did," I replied, leaning back in my leather chair. My voice was completely steady. "They are demanding a mandatory licensing surrender under threat of antitrust litigation. Do you want me to draft a standard rejection letter?" he asked. "We can shut down their legal arguments in an afternoon. Their grounds for an antitrust suit are laughable. It is a pure intimidation tactic." "No," I said smoothly. "I do not want to shut them down. I want to invite them in." There was a brief pause on the line. "Invite them in. Are you sure?" "I have never been more sure of anything in my life," I told him. "I want you to reply to their legal team today. Tell them the holding firm is open to a negotiation. Tell them our leadership team prefers to handle sensitive licensing acquisitions in person. But do not use my name. Let them continue to think they are dealing with a faceless corporate entity." "Understood," my lawyer said, catching on to my tone. "I will draft the response immediately. We will deny their initial aggressive terms, but leave the door wide open for a meeting. We will make them think their intimidation tactics actually worked." "Exactly," I said. "Let them think they have the upper hand. Let them walk into the room believing they are the smartest people there." I hung up the phone and looked back down at my father's signature. He had thrown away his 11-year-old daughter because he thought she had no value. He had bet his entire future on the golden child. And now, 18 years later, that golden child had driven his company to the edge of ruin. They needed Ecobond to survive. They needed my patent to keep their factories open. They needed me. They just did not know it yet. I opened a secure terminal on my computer and began pulling the public financial filings for Hastings Manufacturing. If I was going to invite them to the table, I needed to know exactly how deep their desperation went. I needed to see every hidden flaw, every bleeding account, every lie they were telling their shareholders. I spent the next 4 hours doing what I do best. I followed the numbers, and what I found buried deep in the footnotes of their quarterly reports was far worse than a few EPA fines. Claire had not just mismanaged the company, she had been actively destroying it from the inside out. My family was about to learn a very painful lesson. A bad investment to the wrong people is an absolute goldmine in the right hands. And the ledger was finally about to be balanced. The heavy sound of Seattle rain beating against the floor-to-ceiling glass of my office faded entirely into the background. I stared at my father's signature at the bottom of the legal threat. The aggressive slant of the ink, the sharp angles of the letters, and the heavy pressure of the pen were identical to the strokes I had memorized 18 years ago. Staring at that piece of paper, I was no longer a 29-year-old forensic accountant holding the keys to a massive intellectual property empire. I was 11 years old again, standing in the vast pristine foyer of my parents' upscale suburban home with the smell of lemon polish and expensive floral perfume burning my nose. Growing up in the Hastings household, love was treated strictly as a return on investment. My twin sister Claire was the blue-chip stock. She was the golden child, the undeniable prodigy destined to inherit and elevate Hastings Manufacturing. By the time we were 9, Claire was playing complex concertos on her violin, reading at a high school level, and charming every wealthy investor my parents brought home for dinner. She was flawless polite and entirely focused on becoming the perfect heir. I was the complete opposite. I lived with severe undiagnosed attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. My mind felt like a radio constantly flipping between stations at full volume. I could not sit quietly during my mother's elegant dinner parties. I struggled to focus on basic math worksheets. I lost my homework, I forgot my chores, and I was constantly moving. In a family that worshipped order, prestige, and perfection, I was a loud, messy liability. My parents did not believe in learning differences or specialized support. They believed in discipline and image. Every dollar they spent on my tutors felt to them like money poured down a drain. I remember hiding at the top of the stairs, listening to my father complain to my mother that my poor grades were embarrassing the family name. My mother would sigh and say I was a distraction to Claire's development. I was the dark stain on their pristine reputation. I carried that shame in absolute silence, apologizing constantly just for existing in their space. The ultimate betrayal happened on a Tuesday morning in late August. I came down the sweeping oak staircase expecting a normal summer breakfast. Instead, the foyer was eerily quiet. My mother, Patricia, was standing by the front door wearing a crisp tennis outfit, looking incredibly bored. At her feet sat two large black plastic garbage bags. I asked her what was going on. She did not kneel to hug me. She did not offer a gentle explanation. She looked at me with cold, practical eyes and told me to put on my shoes. She said Claire was entering a crucial phase of her academic and musical training, and the house needed to be completely peaceful. She told me I was too disruptive, too expensive, and too much of a drain on the family resources. They had decided it was best for everyone if I lived somewhere else. I looked at the black garbage bags. They contained my clothes, my few books, and my favorite stuffed rabbit. They had not even given me the dignity of a suitcase. My father, Richard, walked out of his home office, holding a thick manila folder. He picked up the garbage bags without a word and walked out to his luxury SUV. I looked upstairs, hoping to see Claire, hoping my twin sister would come down and stop them. Claire was standing at the top of the landing. She looked down at me for a long moment, then turned around and walked back into her bedroom, closing the door. The drive took 3 agonizing hours. We left the manicured lawns and gated communities behind, driving deep into a gritty working-class neighborhood on the edge of the state. My father did not turn on the radio. He did not ask how I felt. The silence in the car was suffocating. He treated the journey like a tedious business errand, a minor inconvenience. He was finally crossing off his schedule. We pulled up to a small weathered house with a sagging front porch and faded siding. This was the home of his older brother, Uncle Thomas. Thomas was the absolute black sheep of the Hastings family. He was a self-made accountant who drove an old truck, lived simply and openly despised my father's ruthless social climbing. They had not spoken in half a decade. My father carried the garbage bags to the porch and knocked. Uncle Thomas opened the door holding a coffee mug. He looked at the trash bags, then at my terrified, tear-streaked face, and finally at his brother. My father did not step inside. He handed Thomas the manila folder and a certified check. He said the check would cover my basic expenses for the year. He said the papers inside made the arrangement permanent. I stood frozen on the porch as my father pulled a pen from his jacket pocket. Right there, leaning against the wooden railing, he signed the documents. He legally relinquished all his parental rights and transferred my guardianship to Thomas. He severed his ties to his own daughter with a few strokes of a pen to save his company money and protect his golden child. He handed the folder back to Thomas, turned around, and walked to his car. He drove away without ever looking in the rearview mirror. I braced myself, waiting for Uncle Thomas to yell at me or tell me I was a burden. Instead, Thomas set his coffee mug down, picked up my garbage bags, and told me to come inside out of the cold. Over the next 18 years, Uncle Thomas became my anchor, my mentor, and my true father. He did not treat me like a broken toy. He was a practical, numbers-driven man who understood how the real world operated. Within a week, he recognized that my restless brain was not a defect. My severe ADHD gave me an incredible ability to hyper-focus on complex details when I was properly stimulated. I did not think in straight lines like normal students. I saw expansive interconnected patterns. Thomas decided to channel that chaotic energy into the most rigid discipline he knew, forensic accounting. He sat me down at his battered kitchen table, surrounded by towering stacks of corporate ledgers, tax returns, and balance sheets. He taught me how money moved through the world. He taught me how corrupt executives hid their stolen funds in plain sight. He showed me how to trace invisible assets across multiple shell companies. Under his guidance, my greatest weakness became an unstoppable superpower. I could scan hundreds of pages of dry financial data and instantly spot the single missing decimal point, the tiny fabricated expense, or the hidden offshore transfer. Thomas empowered me. He taught me that loud, flashy wealth, like the kind my parents flaunted, was fragile and built on ego. He taught me the true power of silent wealth, wealth you control from the shadows without anyone knowing your name. He showed me how to secure patents, how to structure intellectual property holdings, and how to build a fortress of legal contracts that no one could ever breach. When he passed away, he left his entire holding firm to me, knowing I had the precise skills to protect it and grow it. He gave me an empire and the wisdom to keep myself hidden from those who would try to tear it down. I blinked hard, pulling myself out of the bitter memory. The Seattle rain continued its steady rhythm against the glass. The air in my office felt crisp and cool. I looked down at the cease and desist letter from Hastings Manufacturing again. The fear that had briefly gripped my chest evaporated, replaced by a slow-burning absolute certainty. I was no longer that helpless 11-year-old girl crying over garbage bags on a sagging porch. I was a grown woman running a highly lucrative firm, holding the exact patent that my father and my perfect twin sister desperately needed to survive. They were facing federal bankruptcy and environmental ruin. Their fragile, loud empire was crumbling, and they had blindly sent a hostile legal threat to the one person on earth who knew exactly how to destroy them completely. I reached across my mahogany desk and picked up the phone. I dialed my lead corporate attorney. He answered on the second ring. "I want to respond to the Hastings threat," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady. "Are we sending a standard rejection?" he asked. "We have more than enough leverage to bury their antitrust claims before they even file." "No," I replied. "We are going to string them along. Let them think they are dealing with a massive faceless corporation. Deny their initial offer, but leave the door open for negotiation." "You want to negotiate with them?" he asked, sounding surprised. "I want them to think they have a chance," I said. "Demand a full financial audit of their manufacturing company before we agree to any licensing terms. Tell them it is standard procedure for an intellectual property transfer of this magnitude. Do not mention my name. Use the holding company letterhead and route all communications through your office. I want them absolutely desperate and completely blind." "Understood," my lawyer said. "I will draft the response and demand their internal ledgers today." I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair, staring out at the Seattle skyline. My parents had thrown me away to protect their golden child and save their business. Now, 18 years later, that same business was begging for a lifeline, and I was the one holding the rope. They wanted to play a ruthless corporate game. I was going to teach them exactly what happens when you hand a forensic accountant the matches to burn down your house. 3 days after my attorney sent our initial response, the counteroffer arrived. It was exactly as arrogant as I had anticipated. The legal counsel for Hastings Manufacturing, a prestigious downtown Seattle law firm, replied with a demand that perfectly mirrored my family's fundamental worldview. They stated that before they would even entertain a formal sit-down to discuss acquiring the Ecobond patent, they required a full financial audit of my holding firm. They wanted proof that we had the capital and the corporate infrastructure to manage a transaction of this magnitude. In their minds, they were the titans of industry dealing with a lucky amateur. They wanted to strip my firm bare and look at our ledgers to ensure we were worthy of breathing the same air. I laughed out loud in my quiet office. It was a cold, sharp sound. They were handing me the exact weapon I needed without even realizing it. I called my lead counsel, Robert, immediately. I told him to accept their demand for a financial review, but to invoke a standard mutual due diligence clause. If they wanted to see the financial health of the entity holding the patent, they legally had to provide their own unredacted financials to prove they had the liquidity to purchase it. It is a standard operational procedure in corporate acquisitions. You do not get to look inside my house unless you open your own doors first. They agreed within 2 hours. Their confidence was staggering. They clearly believed that whatever mid-level accountant my holding firm employed would just glance at their top-line revenue, see the famous Hastings Manufacturing letterhead, and be adequately intimidated. They assumed someone would just check their gross profit margins and rubber-stamp the meeting. They forgot that the person sitting on the other side of the digital data room was a senior forensic accountant who had spent the last 15 years learning how to hunt down buried secrets. At exactly 9 in the morning on a crisp Thursday, they granted my office access to their secure virtual server. It contained 5 years of complete corporate ledgers, tax returns, capital expenditure, reports, and executive compensation packages. I locked my office door, poured a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, and opened the first spreadsheet. For the first hour, I just scanned the macro data. On paper, Hastings Manufacturing looked like a towering success. They reported massive gross revenues climbing steadily, year over year. But as Uncle Thomas had drilled into my head during those long nights at his kitchen table, gross revenue is just a vanity metric. It is the number you show off at cocktail parties. Net profit and cash flow are the only numbers that tell the truth. I started digging into the granular details. I isolated the operating expenses, the capital depreciation, and the executive discretionary funds. That is when the pristine illusion of Claire Hastings, the brilliant Ivy League educated chief executive officer, began to shatter completely. My twin sister was not a corporate genius. She was a parasite wearing a tailored suit. I pulled up the vendor payout logs for the previous 36 months and began cross-referencing them with the corporate credit card statements. The level of embezzlement was not even sophisticated. It was sloppy, reckless, and dripping with entitlement. Claire had been treating a massive industrial manufacturing firm like her own personal endless trust fund. I found a recurring monthly expense coded under client relations and strategic networking. It was $32,000 a month. I traced the routing numbers through 3 different intermediary accounts. The money was not paying for client dinners or industry conferences. It was covering the mortgage on a 6,000 square foot luxury penthouse in downtown Portland overlooking the river. The lease was signed under a shell company, but the primary resident listed on the utility bills was Claire Hastings. I kept digging, letting the cold analytical part of my brain take complete control. I found a line item in the research and development budget for an advanced mobility testing vehicle. It was not a piece of factory equipment. It was a customized, imported Porsche sports car registered directly to Claire. I found $50,000 hidden in the quarterly employee wellness budget that had actually paid for a 2-week private yacht charter in the Mediterranean. I found exorbitant charges for private country club memberships, designer wardrobes, and upscale dining, all buried under vague corporate tax codes like operational morale and executive consulting. When I scrutinized the corporate tax filings from the past 3 years, the discrepancies became glaringly obvious. The reported depreciation of their manufacturing assets did not match the physical reality of their production output. An entire factory floor in Ohio had been written off as a total loss for tax purposes, yet the utility bills proved they were running it 24 hours a day. That is federal tax fraud. That is the kind of detail a standard merger and acquisition lawyer might gloss over, but an auditor trained by Thomas spots it instantly. The deeper I dug, the worse the stench became. Claire had authorized a series of unsecured loans from the corporate treasury to an entity called Blue Horizon Ventures. I pulled the state registry records for Blue Horizon. The registered agent was a man named David. A quick search of Claire's heavily curated social media profiles confirmed my suspicion. David was her personal trainer and rumored romantic partner. She was literally funneling corporate manufacturing capital into a fake venture firm to finance her personal life. It was breathtaking in its audacity. Over a period of 3 years, my supposedly brilliant sister had siphoned nearly $2 million out of the company operating capital. She had bled the business dry to maintain an illusion of extreme wealth and untouchable success. But the lavish spending was only half the story. The truly horrifying reality emerged when I looked at where the money was not going. I opened the files for the manufacturing floor budgets. The equipment maintenance funds had been slashed by 80% over the past 4 years. The safety compliance budget was practically non-existent. Hastings Manufacturing was running on outdated machinery, pushing their floor workers to the absolute limit while ignoring crucial mechanical upgrades. They had not invested a single dollar into modernizing their chemical processing systems since our father handed Claire the keys to the empire. That realization led me straight into the darkest corner of their financial records, the liability column. I found a subfolder labeled simply Regulatory Compliance. It was heavily encrypted, but as part of the mutual due diligence agreement, they were legally required to provide the decryption keys for all active liability disclosures. I unlocked the folder, and the final pieces of their desperate puzzle snapped into perfect, terrifying clarity. There were dozens of internal memos from their own safety inspectors warning Claire that their primary chemical bonding agents were severely outdated and highly toxic. There were frantic emails from their plant managers begging for funds to upgrade the filtration systems. Claire had ignored all of them. She had diverted the upgrade funds to pay for her penthouse and her Mediterranean vacations. And then I found the notices from the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. They were not just minor citations. They were final warnings. The EPA had tested the groundwater and air quality around the Hastings manufacturing plants. The toxicity levels were drastically above the new federal limits. The government was preparing to issue millions of dollars in punitive fines. But worse than the fines was the operational mandate. The EPA had given them exactly 90 days to completely overhaul their chemical bonding process or face a forced federal shutdown of all their factories. A shutdown meant immediate insolvency. It meant zero revenue. It meant missed payrolls, defaulted loans, and total collapse. But that was not the end of the nightmare for Claire. If the company went into federal bankruptcy, the court would appoint an independent receiver to audit the books. An auditor would instantly spot the $2 million missing from the operating capital. They would see the penthouse, the sports car, and the yachts. Claire would not just lose her title as CEO. She would face federal indictment for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and tax evasion. She would go to federal prison. I sat back in my chair staring at the glowing monitors. The silence of my office felt heavy, charged with the weight of what I had just uncovered. Everything made perfect sense now. Their arrogant demand letters, their sudden aggressive push to acquire the EcoBond patent. They were not trying to innovate. They were trying to orchestrate a massive cover-up to save Claire from wearing a prison jumpsuit. EcoBond was the only chemical compound on the market that could replace their toxic adhesive without requiring them to replace their entire assembly line. If they owned the patent, they could immediately satisfy the EPA requirements and stop the federal shutdown. But the plan was actually much more sinister and much more desperate than just passing an environmental inspection. I opened the external communications log and found the smoking gun. Claire and my father had been actively pitching a new round of Series C funding to a group of major venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. The pitch deck was built entirely on a lie. They were telling investors that Hastings Manufacturing was on the verge of acquiring a revolutionary green technology patent that would double their production speed and corner the eco-friendly industrial market. They were asking for $30 million in fresh capital. I traced the projected allocation of that $30 million. They claimed they needed the capital to scale up production and launch a global marketing campaign. But the internal hidden ledger told the real story. If they secured that funding, Claire planned to secretly use a portion of the incoming investor cash to quietly replace the $2 million she had embezzled. She was going to plug the massive hole in the balance sheet before any federal auditor could ever see it. She would pay off the EPA fines, transition to the EcoBond formula, and walk away completely clean, looking like a visionary leader who had modernized a legacy company. They just needed one thing to make the entire house of cards stand up. They needed me to surrender my patent. They needed the 11-year-old girl they had thrown out like garbage to unknowingly hand them the exact tool required to save their golden child from total destruction. I closed the final spreadsheet and carefully exported the entire data room onto my secure offline servers. I created triple encrypted backups of every single fraudulent transaction, every ignored safety memo, and every desperate email to their venture capital targets. I organized the evidence into pristine chronological files. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. It was a loaded weapon just waiting for someone to pull the trigger. My heart was pounding with a slow, steady rhythm. For 18 years, I had carried the heavy, suffocating weight of being the unwanted daughter. I had laid awake at night wondering why I was not smart enough, or quiet enough, or perfect enough to earn a place at their dinner table. I had believed their narrative that Claire was the brilliant future and I was the broken mistake. Looking at the undeniable proof of their corruption, I realized the absolute truth. I was never a broken mistake. I was just inconvenient to people who lacked basic integrity. I had built a clean, highly profitable holding firm through grueling hard work and unrelenting discipline. Claire had been handed a kingdom and she had rotted it from the inside out with her own greed. I picked up my phone and called Robert. His voice was brisk and professional when he answered. "Did you find anything interesting in their financials, Chloe?" he asked. "I found everything I said." My voice was smooth, lacking any trace of the emotional earthquake I had just experienced. "They are financially bleeding out, Robert. They have massive hidden liabilities and severe regulatory exposure. They are desperate." Robert chuckled quietly. "So we reject their offer and walk away. We let them sink under their own weight." "No," I said, standing up from my desk and walking over to the window. The Seattle skyline was finally clearing, the dark storm clouds beginning to break apart over the water. "I do not want to walk away. If we just say no, they will find another way to cheat the system. They will find some other company to steal from. I want to schedule a preliminary negotiation meeting." "You want to meet with them?" Robert sounded deeply confused. "Chloe, if their books are that toxic, why would we let them anywhere near our intellectual property?" "Because I want them to firmly believe they have won," I told him. "I want you to send an email to their legal counsel. Tell them our holding firm is very impressed by their market presence. Tell them we are open to drafting an exclusive licensing agreement. But make it clear that our CEO is highly private and does not participate in preliminary technical negotiations. Tell them they will be dealing directly with our lead accountant to hammer out the terms and conditions." Robert paused. "You want to handle the negotiations yourself, posing as a lower-level employee?" "Exactly," I said. "They will never suspect the accountant crunching the numbers is the person who actually holds the keys to the entire empire. They will let their guard down. They will show us exactly who they are." "It is a risky play," Chloe, Robert warned. "If they are as desperate as you say, they might try something highly unethical to secure those patent rights." "I am counting on it," I replied. "Let them try. Set the meeting for next week." I ended the call and stood looking at my reflection in the glass. The scared little girl holding trash bags on a porch was gone forever. In her place was a woman who knew exactly how to dismantle a corrupt empire brick by brick. My family was about to learn that the most dangerous person in any boardroom is never the one making the loudest demands. The most dangerous person is the quiet accountant sitting in the corner who has already read the bottom line. And I was going to make sure their bottom line read absolute zero. I knew they would try to find a back door. When you are drowning in debt and facing federal indictments, you do not just wait for a formal response from an anonymous holding company. You dig. You look for weak links in the armor. I had intentionally left my professional profiles public, but stripped of any executive titles. To the outside world, I was simply Chloe Hastings' lead accountant. It was the perfect camouflage. I knew that someone from their desperate legal team would scour the internet looking for an inside connection. On a Tuesday afternoon, my computer monitor pinged with a notification. Someone from the Hastings Manufacturing Executive Network had viewed my profile. An hour later, the receptionist buzzed my office line to say a woman named Patricia was on hold, practically hyperventilating and claiming to be my mother. 18 years of absolute silence. Not a single birthday card. Not a graduation gift. Not a phone call to see if the daughter they discarded had even survived. But now that I worked for the company holding their only lifeline, my mother suddenly knew my number. I told the receptionist to patch her through. I took a slow breath and picked up the receiver. "Chloe." "Oh my goodness, Chloe, is it really you?" Patricia sounded breathless, frantic, and dripping with a theatrical sorrow that made my stomach turn. Her voice cracked flawlessly. "I have been looking for you for so long. We all have. Your father and I have missed you so terribly. Please tell me you are okay." It was a masterful performance. If I had still been that terrified 11-year-old girl, I might have believed the raw emotion pouring through the speaker. But I was an auditor. I analyzed facts, not feelings. The fact was they only remembered I existed when they needed something I possessed. "I am fine, Patricia," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "Please call me Mom," she pleaded, her voice hitching with a fake sob. "We want to see you. We want to apologize for the past to make things right. Claire is here too. We are all flying into Seattle this weekend. Please let us take you to dinner. Let us be a family again." I could have hung up. I could have told her to drown in her own toxic waste. But Uncle Thomas had taught me to always let a fraudster lay all their cards on the table. You never interrupt an enemy when they are making a mistake. I told her I would meet them. She named an exclusive high-end steakhouse downtown. A place where the lighting was dim, the steaks were dry-aged, and the checks routinely ran into the thousands. It was a calculated power move designed to intimidate a low-level accountant. I agreed to meet them on Friday night at 7. I arrived 10 minutes early, wearing a simple beige blouse and a modest gray blazer. I wanted to look exactly like the invisible corporate drone they expected to see. I checked my expensive designer watch, slipped it into my purse, and replaced it with a cheap plastic one. The host led me to a secluded private booth in the back of the restaurant, where the noise of the dining room faded into a dull hum. At exactly 7:15, they walked in. My parents had aged, but they carried themselves with the same arrogant posture that demanded the room part for them. Richard wore a tailored charcoal suit that screamed old money and unchecked authority. Patricia was draped in dark silk and heavy gold jewelry, and right behind them was Claire, my twin sister, the golden child. She wore a striking crimson designer dress, her posture radiating unearned superiority. She looked exactly like a woman who believed she owned the world, completely unaware that her empire was crumbling beneath her feet. When Patricia saw me, she gasped dramatically and rushed forward, pulling me into a suffocating embrace. "My beautiful girl," she cried, burying her face in my shoulder. "Look at you. You grew up so well." Richard offered a stiff, formal pat on my back, while Claire managed a tight, patronizing smile. "Hello, Chloe," Claire said, taking the seat directly across from me. "It has been a long time. You look very plain. I mean, professional." I forced a shy, uncertain smile, playing the role they had scripted for me. "It is nice to see you all," I said quietly. For the first hour, they put on a spectacular show of fake interest. They ordered $100 bottles of wine and commanded the waitstaff like royalty. Patricia asked hollow questions about my life, pretending to care about my cramped apartment and my supposedly mundane accounting job. I fed them exactly what they wanted to hear. I told them I worked long hours checking ledgers for a massive holding firm that barely noticed me. I painted myself as a lonely, overworked number cruncher, struggling to pay rent in a costly city. Every time I downplayed my success, I saw Richard and Claire exchange brief, triumphant glances. They were relaxing. They were settling into the comfortable belief that they were the apex predators at the table, and I was just an easy mark. They thought my lack of flashy jewelry and my quiet demeanor meant I had achieved nothing. They did not understand that true power whispers, while desperation screams. By the time the main courses were cleared away, the performative affection completely evaporated. The transition was so abrupt, it was almost comical. Richard set his wineglass down, wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, and leaned forward, resting his forearms on the heavy oak table. The loving father routine vanished entirely, replaced by the cold, calculating executive who had signed me away 18 years ago. "Chloe," he started, his voice dropping into a serious business register. "We did not just come here to catch up. We came here because we are in a unique position to help each other. As family." I looked down at my hands, twisting my cheap plastic watch, acting perfectly oblivious. "Help each other how?" Richard sighed, a heavy practice sound designed to make me feel small. "Hastings Manufacturing is going through a transitional phase. We are expanding, but we are dealing with some regulatory red tape. Nothing we cannot handle, of course, but we need a specific chemical patent to finalize a very lucrative manufacturing contract." I kept my face blank. "What does that have to do with me?" Claire took over, leaning across the table with a predatory gleam in her eyes. "The patent we need is called EcoBond. It is owned by the holding firm you work for. We know you manage the ledgers for that specific portfolio, Chloe. We checked the public registry. Your name is listed as a point of contact for their accounting department." They had done exactly what I expected. They had searched the public filings, seen my name buried in the accounting disclosures, and assumed I was just a lowly paper pusher with access to the company's servers. They had absolutely no idea that I owned the entire building. "My boss is very strict about those patents," I stammered, shrinking back into the booth, portraying a nervous employee. "I just balance the books. I do not make executive decisions. I cannot just ask them to sell it to you." Patricia reached across the table and placed her cold hand over mine. "We are not asking you to negotiate a sale, sweetheart. We know your bosses are being unreasonable. They have already rejected our perfectly generous licensing offers. They're trying to hold a family business hostage. We just need a little inside help to level the playing field." I pulled my hand out from under my mother's grip. "Inside help? What do you mean?" Richard lowered his voice, glancing around the dim restaurant to make sure no one was listening. "The formula for EcoBond is stored on your company servers. As the lead accountant, you have security clearance to access the proprietary data rooms. All we need you to do is copy the chemical formulations onto a flash drive and bring it to us. I stared at him, letting genuine shock widen my eyes. Not at the request, but at the sheer absolute audacity of it. You want me to steal corporate trade secrets? That is a federal crime. I could go to prison. Claire rolled her eyes, letting out a harsh, bitter laugh. Do not be so dramatic, Chloe. Nobody is going to prison. The firm you work for is a disorganized mess. They will not even notice someone accessed the files until we have already patented a slight variation of the formula under a different name. It happens every day in the corporate world. I shook my head vigorously, putting on a perfect display of panicked reluctance. I cannot do that. I could lose my job. I could lose my entire career. That is when Richard pulled a sleek leather envelope from his jacket and slid it across the table. He flipped it open, revealing a certified cashier's check. The numbers were printed in bold black ink. $50,000. Consider it a consulting fee, Richard said smoothly. You give us the flash drive. We give you the check. That is more than you probably make in an entire year punching numbers for those executives. You can upgrade your life, Chloe. You can finally stop struggling. I stared at the check. $50,000. They were offering me pennies to steal a patent worth tens of millions of dollars. They were willing to destroy my entire life, my freedom, and my professional reputation just to cover up Claire's massive embezzlement and save their own skins from a federal indictment. I looked up at my twin sister. She was not smiling anymore. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated entitlement. She did not see a sister sitting across from her. She saw a disposable tool. You owe us, Chloe. Claire sneered, her voice dripping with venom. Mom and Dad gave you life. They sacrificed everything to build this family empire, and you have done absolutely nothing but take up space. This is your chance to finally be useful to this family. Do not ruin it by being a coward. The silence at the table was suffocating. I looked from Claire to Richard to Patricia. They sat there radiating smug certainty, fully expecting me to fold. They expected the broken, rejected 11-year-old girl to eagerly grab the money and risk federal prison just to earn a scrap of their validation. They had not changed at all. 18 years had not softened their hearts or taught them humility. It had only made them more ruthless, more corrupt, and infinitely more desperate. They were perfectly willing to throw me to the wolves a second time without a single moment of hesitation. They were not here to apologize. They were here to use me as a human shield to protect their failing golden child. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the scared accountant persona slip away just a fraction. I looked down at the $50,000 check and then back up at my father's expectant face. I slowly reached out and pulled the leather envelope toward my side of the table. A triumphant smirk broke across Claire's face, and Richard nodded approvingly, leaning back in his chair. They thought they had just bought my soul for 50 grand. I need to protect myself, I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing the artificial tremble. If I am going to take this kind of massive legal risk, I cannot just hand you a flash drive on blind faith. I need a signed agreement, a contract guaranteeing my compensation and protecting me from any corporate liability once Hastings Manufacturing takes over the formula. Richard chuckled, waving his hand dismissively. We can draft an independent consulting agreement. That is simple. We will make it look completely legitimate. You just focus on getting the data room files. I will draft the contract myself. I countered, locking eyes with him. I know the legal loopholes in my firm's non-disclosure agreements. I will write a consulting contract that protects all of us. When it is ready, I will bring it to you with the data. Patricia beamed, raising her wine glass. I knew you would do the right thing, sweetheart. You always were a smart girl when you applied yourself. I smiled back, picking up my cheap plastic watch from the table and strapping it back onto my wrist. I told them I would be in touch by the end of the week. I stood up, grabbed my purse and walked out of the upscale steakhouse, leaving them to celebrate their supposed victory. As I stepped out into the cool Seattle night air, I felt a profound sense of closure wash over me. I finally had my answer. They were completely unredeemable. I pulled my cell phone from my bag and dialed my attorney. The trap was fully set. Now it was time to build the guillotine. The morning after the dinner at the steakhouse, my office felt entirely different. The familiar hum of the Seattle traffic far below usually brought me peace, but today It felt like the steady ticking of a metronome. I sat at my mahogany desk, looking at the blank wall opposite my window. My biological family wanted a pawn. They wanted the frightened 11-year-old girl who would do absolutely anything to earn a single scrap of their affection. I picked up my phone and called Robert, my lead counsel. I told him I was going undercover inside my own company. Robert warned me about the psychological risks, but I was resolute. I was going to give Richard, Patricia, and Claire exactly what they asked for. I was going to hand them enough rope to hang their entire corporate empire. I drafted an email to my father using a generic private address to maintain my cover as a low-level employee. I carefully crafted the language to sound hesitant, submissive, and desperate. I wrote that I had stayed awake all night thinking about their offer. I told them I was terrified of losing my job and going to prison, but that I desperately wanted to help the family and finally be a part of their lives. I agreed to secure the proprietary chemical formulas for the Ecobond patent. However, I insisted on one non-negotiable condition. I needed the consulting agreement we discussed in writing before I pulled a single file from the secured data room. I framed the request as the paranoid demand of a scared accountant needing a safety net. In reality, I was securing a legally binding contract that documented their explicit intent to commit corporate espionage and bribery. Richard replied within the hour. His response was brief and dripping with unearned authority. He told me the contract was being drafted by his personal attorney and that we needed to meet to finalize the logistics of the data transfer. He suggested my cramped apartment. I immediately countered. I told him my roommates were too nosy and suggested we hold our strategy meetings in a private conference room at a quiet co-working space downtown. I chose a building that I secretly leased through one of my secondary holding companies. The standard visitor entry agreement for that specific building explicitly stated that all rooms were subject to audio and visual security monitoring for corporate protection. My father, mother, and sister signed the digital visitor log at the front desk without ever bothering to read the fine print. They legally waived their right to privacy the moment they walked through the glass doors. Just to be absolutely certain every word was captured, I wore a discreet recording device clipped inside my blazer during every single meeting. The cold metal of the microphone resting against my collarbone was a constant physical reminder of the dangerous game I was playing. Over the next 4 weeks, I sat across from my biological family twice a week in that sterile gray conference room. Each meeting was a masterclass in emotional manipulation on their part and forensic evidence gathering on mine. I played my role perfectly. I hunched my shoulders, avoided direct eye contact, and spoke with a nervous stammer. They bought the performance completely. During our second meeting, Richard slid the so-called consulting agreement across the table. It was a beautifully formatted document that essentially promised to pay me $50,000 for providing what they vaguely termed as industry research and proprietary material analysis. It was a thinly veiled contract for the purchase of stolen trade secrets. I read through the pages, acting intimidated by the legal jargon, while internally memorizing every single clause that proved their guilt. I signed the document with a shaking hand and pushed it back to my father. He smiled, folding the paper into his briefcase. He had just handed me written proof of a federal conspiracy. The subsequent meetings grew increasingly bold. Once they believed they had me completely under their control, their arrogance expanded to fill the room. I sat silently while Claire gleefully mapped out the timeline for their fraud. She explained exactly how Hastings Manufacturing would take the stolen Ecobond formula, make a superficial tweak to the chemical composition, and file a modified patent under a new subsidiary name. She bragged about how this stolen technology would instantly cure their environmental violations and satisfy the federal regulators. But Claire did not stop there. The Wire captured her detailing their ultimate financial exit strategy. She outlined how they would use the stolen patent to secure a $30 million cash injection from a group of venture capitalists in California. She explicitly admitted on tape that a large portion of that new investor money would be secretly diverted to cover up the millions of dollars she had already embezzled from the company operating funds. She laughed as she described the investors as gullible sheep. My mother sat next to her, sipping sparkling water and nodding with maternal pride, while her golden child outlined a massive scheme involving wire fraud, corporate theft, and investor deception. Recording these conversations took a staggering emotional toll on me. It is one thing to know conceptually that your parents do not love you. It is entirely another thing to sit 2 feet away from them and watch them treat you like a disposable human shield. Every time Patricia reached out and patted my hand, telling me what a good daughter I was finally becoming, my stomach turned. Her affection was entirely transactional. She was only touching me because she thought I was handing her a stolen empire. There were moments in that conference room when the sheer cruelty of my family threatened to crack my carefully constructed facade. One afternoon, Claire complained about her expensive shoes scuffing on the Seattle sidewalks. She looked at my modest, sensible heels and laughed, telling me I should use my bribe money to finally buy something that did not look like it came from a discount rack. My father chuckled in agreement. I looked at the three of them sitting there in their designer clothes, funded by stolen corporate capital, judging the daughter who actually owned the building they were sitting in. The urge to flip the table and reveal exactly who I was burned in my throat. I wanted to scream. I wanted to show them my executive portfolio and watch their smug faces melt into terror. But I swallowed the anger. I locked it away in a dark, quiet place inside my mind. I leaned heavily on the memory of Uncle Thomas. I remembered the late nights in his kitchen, the smell of old paper and black coffee, the steady rhythm of his voice explaining the true nature of power. Thomas always said that anger is an incredibly expensive emotion and a good accountant never wastes capital. He taught me that the best way to destroy a fraudster is to simply give them a shovel and wait for them to dig a hole deep enough to bury themselves. Whenever the grief of my childhood abandonment threatened to rise up and choke me, I pictured Uncle Thomas tapping a red pen against a ledger. I visualized the numbers. I turned my profound sorrow into a cold, calculated business strategy. My family was not my family anymore. They were simply a hostile corporate entity engaging in illegal practices, and I was conducting a meticulous internal audit. Separating my emotions from the situation was the hardest psychological labor I had ever endured, but it was absolutely necessary for my survival. By the end of the 4th week, the trap was fully constructed. I had gathered a mountain of irrefutable evidence. I possessed the signed fake consulting agreement which definitively linked Richard to the bribery scheme. I had hours of crystal-clear audio recordings of Claire detailing her past embezzlement and her future plans for wire fraud. I had captured Patricia actively participating in the conspiracy and encouraging me to breach my fiduciary duties. I had everything I needed to trigger a federal investigation that would dismantle Hastings manufacturing in a single afternoon. But I was not just going to hand this over to the authorities in quiet. They had abandoned me in a highly visible, humiliating way when I was a child. They had stripped me of my dignity. I was going to ensure that their reckoning matched their arrogance. During our final strategy session at the co-working space, my father demanded to know the exact date I would provide the encrypted flash drive containing the EcoBond formula. I looked down at the table playing the hesitant subordinate one last time. I told him the data room security protocols were strict, but I had engineered a backdoor access code. I promised I would have the complete proprietary files ready by the following Friday. Richard stood up and buttoned his tailored suit jacket. He looked down at me with an expression of supreme triumph. He told me I had finally proven my worth to the Hastings legacy. Claire grabbed her expensive handbag and told me not to mess this up because her entire future was riding on my ability to follow simple instructions. Patricia offered one last fake maternal smile, telling me she would call me to arrange the transfer. They walked out of the conference room, leaving me alone in the quiet space. I reached under my blazer and switched off the recording device for the final time. I sat alone in the room, listening to the silence. The month-long performance was finally over. The desperate daughter act was officially retired. I opened my laptop and transferred the final audio files to a secure encrypted server, sending a direct copy to Robert. I watched the progress bar inch across the screen, each percentage point representing a nail in the coffin of my biological family. They thought they had successfully manipulated a lonely, naive accountant into committing corporate treason. They thought they had secured their escape from federal indictments and financial ruin. They did not know that the flash drive I planned to hand them would be the exact mechanism that triggered their total annihilation. They did not know about the poison pill I had spent the last month quietly weaving into the background of their impending doom. I packed my laptop into my bag and stood up, my spine straight and my shoulders pulled back. The emotional toll of the past month evaporated, leaving behind a profound sense of clarity and purpose. I walked out of the building, stepping into the bright Seattle afternoon, ready to execute the final phase of my plan. I was going to let them stand on their biggest stage, surrounded by their most important investors, and then I was going to pull the floor out from under them completely. The following Monday morning, I sat down in my office with my lead counsel, Robert, to draft the most important document of my entire career. I told Robert exactly what we needed to build. It was not just a licensing agreement. It was a perfectly camouflaged financial guillotine. Uncle Thomas used to tell me that the greatest weapon in the corporate world is never a shouting match or a hostile takeover. The greatest weapon is the sheer unadulterated arrogance of a fraudster who believes they are untouchable. I was going to use my biological family's absolute certainty that I was a slow, incompetent disappointment to orchestrate their complete destruction. We spent 3 grueling days meticulously structuring the contract. On the surface, the document appeared to be exactly what Richard and Claire had requested. It was drafted to look like an incredibly generous, heavily favored licensing agreement, granting Hastings Manufacturing the exclusive rights to the EcoBond formula. I intentionally formatted the first 10 pages to read like standard corporate boilerplate. I wanted to lull them into a false sense of security. I made sure the initial clauses contained all the language Claire had arrogantly outlined during our recorded strategy sessions. It promised them the proprietary chemical data in exchange for a minor royalty percentage, perfectly mirroring the fake narrative that I had managed to manipulate the holding company executives into accepting a terrible deal. But buried deep within the 45-page document starting on page 27 was the trap. In the world of high-stakes acquisitions, it is known as a poison pill. I engineered a series of cascading liability clauses wrapped in dense, impenetrable financial jargon. The contract explicitly stated that the intellectual property transfer was entirely contingent upon the pristine financial health and ethical standing of the acquiring entity. That was the bait. The poison was the penalty. The clause dictated that if Hastings Manufacturing or any of its active executive officers were found to have engaged in any fraudulent activity, corporate embezzlement, undocumented capital diversion, or breach of fiduciary duty at any point prior to the signing of the agreement, the licensing transfer would immediately convert into a debt instrument. And the penalty for that debt was absolute. I wrote the penalty clause with surgical precision. Upon the discovery of any pre-existing financial misconduct, the holding company, my company, would instantly and irrevocably assume full legal ownership of all commercial real estate listed under the Hastings Manufacturing portfolio as unencumbered collateral. That included their massive manufacturing plant, their corporate headquarters, and the distribution warehouses. If they signed this document, they were legally agreeing to hand over the physical foundation of their entire empire the moment their existing fraud was brought to light. Robert read the final draft sitting across from my desk. He took off his reading glasses and looked at me with a mixture of profound professional respect and slight terror. He told me it was the most brilliantly ruthless contract he had ever seen. He pointed out that any competent corporate attorney would spot the poison pill instantly. Any first-year law student would advise their client to run far away from a liability clause that draconian. I smiled, picking up my coffee cup. I told Robert he was absolutely right. A competent attorney would catch it in 10 seconds, but my family was not going to show this to an independent attorney. They could not risk it. They were actively conspiring to commit corporate theft. They believed they were using a desperate, naive accountant to steal trade secrets. They were operating entirely in the shadows, terrified of drawing any official attention to the transaction. They were going to rely entirely on Claire and her Ivy League education to review the paperwork. And Claire, I knew with absolute certainty, would never bother to read the fine print of a document drafted by the sister she considered intellectually inferior. Her ego would simply not allow her to believe I was capable of outsmarting her. I spent Thursday evening preparing the physical props for the final act. I purchased a cheap generic silver flash drive. I loaded it with a series of massive encrypted data files. The files were entirely legitimate, containing complex chemical supply chain logs and public environmental impact studies, but I renamed the folders to look like the highly classified EcoBond proprietary blueprints. I placed the flash drive into a small clear plastic case. It looked exactly like the stolen treasure they had ordered me to retrieve. Then I printed the 45-page contract on heavy bond paper. I placed tabs on the signature lines, making it incredibly easy for them to just flip to the end and sign their names. Every detail was orchestrated to make the process feel fast, smooth, and inevitable. On Friday afternoon, I drove back to the private co-working space for our final meeting. The Seattle traffic was thick, but my mind was perfectly clear. I did not feel nervous. I did not feel the crushing anxiety that used to paralyze me when I was a child living in their house. I felt the steady, rhythmic calm of an auditor closing out a final ledger. I walked into the designated conference room 10 minutes early. I arranged the contract neatly in the center of the table, placing a sleek black pen right next to it. I set the silver flash drive just out of reach, a visual anchor to keep their greed focused and their patience short. They arrived exactly on time. My father walked in first, projecting an aura of tense authority. He wore a dark navy suit and checked his phone twice before even looking at me. Patricia followed close behind, draped in a camel-colored cashmere coat, offering me a tight, patronizing smile that barely reached her eyes. Claire walked in last, carrying a designer tote bag, looking visibly annoyed by the inconvenience of having to be there. "Do you have it?" Richard demanded, skipping any form of greeting. He did not ask how my week was. He did not ask if I had faced any danger securing the files. He just wanted the prize. I nodded, shrinking my posture and pointing a trembling finger toward the silver flash drive on the table. "It is all there," I said, keeping my voice low and breathless. "Every formula, every chemical stress test, every manufacturing blueprint. It took me 3 days to bypass the security protocols, but I got everything you asked for." Claire lunged for the flash drive, but I placed my hand flat over it, pulling it back just an inch. Her eyes flashed with immediate irritation. "What are you doing?" Claire snapped, crossing her arms. "Give it to me. I need the contract signed first," I said, playing the role of the paranoid, desperate accomplice. "I told you I cannot take this kind of risk without protection. I need the consulting agreement and the licensing terms finalized. If my bosses find out what I did, I need to know Hastings Manufacturing is going to take care of me." Richard sighed heavily, exchanging a weary look with my mother, like they were dealing with an unruly toddler. "You are safe, Chloe," Patricia said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We are your family. We protect our own. Just let your sister look at the documents so we can get this over with. We have a flight to catch this evening." I pushed the thick stack of paper across the table toward Claire. "I poured everything into this," I told her, feigning professional pride. "I made sure the royalty structures favor Hastings perfectly. The holding company will barely notice the margins." Claire rolled her eyes, pulling the contract toward her. She flipped open the heavy cover page. I watched her eyes scan the first few paragraphs. She was not reading the legal mechanics. She was just looking for the financial figures. She saw the deeply discounted royalty percentages I had placed at the very beginning, and a smug, satisfied smirk spread across her face. "She thinks she's so smart," Claire muttered, flipping past 10 pages at once. She looked up at my father. "The initial numbers are exactly what we wanted, Dad. She actually managed to hard-code the introductory rate just like I told her to. Read the liability sections," Richard instructed, checking his watch again. "Make sure she did not leave any loose ends that could tie the theft back to us." I held my breath completely still. This was the only moment of true danger. If Claire actually stopped relying on her ego and started reading the text like a proper executive, she would hit page 27. She would see the cascading default clauses. She would see the poison pill. Claire turned to the middle of the document. She glanced at the dense blocks of text. I had intentionally formatted the poison pill section with 0 paragraph breaks, using highly archaic structural phrasing to make it as tedious to read as legally possible. I watched her eyes drag across the page. She lasted exactly 4 seconds before letting out a loud, exasperated sigh. "It is just standard indemnification garbage," Claire said, flipping past the trap without absorbing a single word of it. She copied and pasted a generic corporate shield template. It basically just says, if the product fails, the holding company is not liable for manufacturing defects. It is completely harmless. We will have our own legal team rewrite the operational bylaws once we file the new patent anyway. My heart beat a slow, steady drumline against my ribs. She had not read it. Her absolute belief that a supposedly slow, incompetent sister could never draft a complex legal snare had blinded her completely. Her arrogance had just signed away the entire Hastings empire. "Are we good to go?" Richard asked, his patience completely exhausted. "We are good," Claire confirmed, grabbing the black pen from the table. She flipped directly to the back of the contract, where I had placed the bright yellow signature tabs. She signed her name with a dramatic flourish, acting like a conquering queen cementing her victory. She slid the document to my father. Richard did not even glance at the pages. He trusted his golden child implicitly. He scrawled his aggressive, domineering signature right below hers. Patricia leaned over and patted my cheek as Richard signed the paper. "You did a good job today, Chloe," she murmured. "Maybe you finally found your place in this family." I did not flinch from her touch. I just offered a small, tight smile watching Richard push the finalized contract back across the table. I picked up the stack of papers, checking to ensure the signatures were perfectly aligned. The ink was dark and permanent. They had just legally consented to forfeit every brick, every warehouse, and every acre of commercial real estate they owned the moment their massive embezzlement was brought to light. I reached out and pushed the silver flash drive toward Claire. She snatched it off the table, dropping it carelessly into her designer bag. Richard pulled the familiar leather envelope from his jacket and placed it in front of me. The $50,000 cashier's check. The bribe. The final piece of physical evidence required to prove they had induced a corporate employee to commit fraud. "We will be in touch," Richard said, standing up and adjusting his tie. "Do not contact us directly until we have the new patent officially filed. We need to maintain distance for a few weeks to let the dust settle." "I understand," I said, slipping the check and the 45-page contract into my briefcase. Claire looked down at me one last time, her expression filled with profound pity and undeniable triumph. "Go buy yourself some decent clothes, Chloe," she said, turning toward the door. "You look like a secretary." I watched them walk out of the conference room. I watched my mother link her arm through my father's. I watched my twin sister stride confidently down the hallway, believing she had just saved herself from federal prison and secured her reign over a multi-million-dollar manufacturing empire. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind them. I sat alone in the quiet room, the silence wrapping around me like a warm blanket. I opened my briefcase and looked down at the documents. The trap had not just snapped shut. The lock had been turned, the key had been thrown away, and they had willingly built the cage themselves. I pulled out my cell phone and sent a single text message to Robert. "The contract is signed. Execute the forensic disclosure to the federal regulators immediately." I packed my belongings and walked out of the building. The Seattle rain had finally stopped, leaving the city streets washed clean and shimmering in the late afternoon light. For 18 years, I had carried the suffocating weight of being the disposable daughter, the mistake, the broken child they had thrown away to protect their legacy. But as I walked to my car, holding the legal instrument of their total destruction, I did not feel broken anymore. I felt powerful. I felt whole. I had played the exact role they demanded of me, and I had used their own boundless greed to orchestrate a financial masterpiece. They wanted a submissive accountant who followed orders without question. I gave them exactly what they asked for. Now, all that was left was to walk into their boardroom, look them dead in the eye, and show them the final, devastating cost of their investment. The boardroom air tasted like stale coffee and unearned prestige. It was a suffocating space filled with expensive mahogany and the hum of high-powered air conditioning that did nothing to cool the rising tension of a failing business empire. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the downtown headquarters, the Seattle skyline was an unforgiving expanse of steel and gray clouds that perfectly mirrored the precarious situation of Hastings manufacturing. Inside the room, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of anxiety, masked by overpriced cologne, and the desperate ambition of a family trying to maintain a facade of absolute success to their final group of potential investors. Richard Hastings stood at the head of the table, his posture radiating a predatory confidence that I had known my entire life. He was a man who measured his value by the size of his office and the influence of his inner circle. Beside him sat my twin sister, Claire. She was draped in a crimson designer dress, her hair styled into a perfect wave, and her expression one of utter boredom, as if she were waiting for the meeting to conclude so she could move on to more important things. They believed they were the masters of their own destiny. They were basking in the glow of an impending victory, fully convinced that they had successfully outmaneuvered the system to save their dying company. They were the stars of their own show, and they fully expected every person in that room to applaud their brilliance. They had been speaking for nearly 20 minutes, telling the investors a carefully rehearsed story about the future of Hastings manufacturing. Richard used his deep, booming voice to paint a picture of technological innovation and market dominance. He described a breakthrough licensing agreement that would save the company from impending regulatory collapse. He spoke about vision and long-term planning and the undeniable strength of their corporate leadership. Claire interjected with practiced grace, adding sophisticated industry buzzwords to make the plan sound even more inevitable. They were charming the room, and I could see the investors leaning in, clearly swayed by the performance. They thought they had found the life raft they needed to keep their capital afloat. They did not realize that the lifeboat they had purchased was already taking on water. I stood in the hallway just outside the heavy double doors, listening to the muffled sound of their deception. My counsel Robert and his associate Sarah stood on either side of me, their faces stoic and ready. I checked my reflection in the polished glass of the wall. I did not look like the scared girl in garbage bags on a cold porch or the quiet, invisible accountant they had mocked at the steakhouse. I looked like the person who actually owned the chair at the head of that table. I smoothed the lapel of my tailored grey suit and took one final steady breath. It was time for the truth to step into the light. I signaled Robert, and he gripped the handles of the heavy oak doors. They swung open with a slow, resonant thud that echoed through the silence of the boardroom, instantly severing the flow of Richard's practiced speech. All heads turned toward the entrance. 30 pairs of eyes scanned us as we walked in with the unhurried rhythmic pace of people who had nowhere else to be. I led the way, my heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. The sound was like a countdown ticking toward their destruction. When Richard saw me, his face hardened with immediate annoyance. He did not recognize me as a threat. He only saw an unwelcome interruption that had ruined his perfect timing. Who authorized this intrusion? He barked, his voice laced with the irritation of a man who was used to being the most important person in any room. We are in the middle of a private shareholder meeting, and I do not recall any administrative staff being invited. Security needs to be notified immediately. Get out of here before I have you escorted from the building. The investors sat in stiff silence, looking from Richard to me with confused expressions. They were trying to figure out why a woman in a professional suit was walking into their high-stakes boardroom with 2 lawyers and an aura of absolute authority. Claire leaned forward, squinting to see me better. The recognition hit her slowly like a wave of cold water. Her smile vanished and her posture stiffened. She leaned toward Richard and whispered something frantically, but he ignored her, still focused on asserting his dominance over me. I stopped at the edge of the mahogany table. I did not look like a subordinate, and I did not look like the invisible sister he had cast aside. I looked like an executive. I am not here as an employee of your firm, Richard, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room without needing to raise it. And I am certainly not here as your assistant. Richard scoffed, looking around at the investors, as if this were all some amusing misunderstanding. We do not have time for games, lady. If this is a joke, it is not funny. It is not a joke, Richard, and I replied. I am the founder and CEO of the intellectual property holding firm that currently owns the exclusive licensing rights to EcoBond. I walked toward the table, my lawyers shadowing me. My name is Chloe, and if you would have bothered to look beyond your own arrogance over the last 18 years, you might have recognized your own daughter. The effect was instantaneous. It was as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. The color drained from Richard's face, leaving him with a sickly gray pallor that made him look a decade older in a single second. Patricia gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. Claire went perfectly still, her eyes wide and disbelieving as she stared at me as if she were looking at a ghost. The investors sat paralyzed, shifting in their chairs and looking down at their notes in a desperate attempt to avoid the unfolding train wreck. The smug certainty that had defined the room only moments ago was gone, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. I walked to the head of the table and placed the original signed patent agreement right in front of my father. I watched his gaze flicker from my face to the document and back again. He looked down at the signature that he had demanded a week ago, and then he looked at me. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. He tried to speak, but only a choked, raspy sound came out. The silence dragged on for a full minute, a painful eternity, where no one moved and no one breathed. This was the moment I had played over in my head 1,000 times during those cold nights in my Seattle office. It was not a moment of joy, but of profound clarity. I finally saw them for what they really were. They were not corporate titans or industry leaders. They were just people who had built their entire identity on a house of cards and had finally met the wind. I looked at Claire. She was looking at her own hands, her face twisted with a mixture of terror and realization. She knew exactly what I was holding in my briefcase, and she knew exactly why I was here. The game was up, the facade was shattered, and the golden child was staring into the face of a future she had never once considered possible. The board members began to murmur to each other, their voices low and sharp. They were starting to piece it together. The hostile takeover attempts, the desperate financial secrecy, the missing funds, the patent acquisition. Everything that had been a mystery for weeks suddenly had a name and a face attached to it. They were looking at me not as a low-level accountant, but as the person who held their future in her hands. Richard finally managed to find his voice, but it sounded thin and reedy. "This is a mistake," he whispered, his authority crumbling into dust. "You do not have the standing to be here. We have a contract. We are in the middle of a business deal." I leaned over the table, getting closer to his face, so he could see the absolute absence of mercy in my expression. "The contract is indeed valid, Richard. You signed it yourself. You and your golden child and your legal team. You signed it willingly. You did not even read the fine print. But that is the thing about contracts. They do not care about your intentions. They only care about the truth." I turned to address the investors, my voice clear and authoritative. "Gentlemen and ladies, I am sure you have many questions about the current state of Hastings Manufacturing. I suggest you listen very carefully to what is about to be presented, because everything you were told this morning is a lie. This company is not being saved. It is being liquidated by the consequences of its own leadership." I saw Patricia try to stand up, but her legs seemed to give out beneath her and she slumped back into her chair. Her eyes were darting around the room, looking for an exit or a sympathetic face, but finding none. They had burned every bridge they had ever crossed. They were alone with their own wreckage, and I was the one who had finally turned the lights on to reveal it. The weight of the moment felt heavy and ancient. 18 years of being the spare child, of being the financial drain, of being the ghost in their hallways, culminated in this single hour of exposure. They had spent nearly 2 decades telling themselves that I was a failure, that I was the one who needed them to survive. But as they sat there watching me take control of their boardroom, they were forced to confront the reality that I had never needed them at all. I had built a legacy in the shadows while they had been busy building a monument to their own ego. My father looked at the documents on the table, then at the lawyers flanking me. He was searching for an angle, a way out, a loophole, but he knew better. He knew exactly who Uncle Thomas was, and he knew that if I was sitting here today, I had come prepared to finish the story. I turned back to Claire. She was staring at me, her expression hardening into a familiar sneer of defiance. She was trying to call my bluff, trying to find the vulnerability that had made me easy to throw away 18 years ago. But she would find nothing. I was no longer the girl who apologized for existing. I was the woman who had already won. The room was still charged with that agonizing silence. No one was leaving. No one was laughing. They were all caught in the gravity of what I had just revealed. The CEO of Hastings Manufacturing was a fraud. The company was on the brink of total collapse, and the person who held the patent to save them was the very child they had cast out into a storm with 2 garbage bags of belongings. It was the most beautiful moment of my entire life. I looked at each of them in turn, making sure they saw the absolute finality in my eyes. I had not come to scream. I had not come to argue. I had come to finish a transaction that began 18 years ago, on a sagging porch in the rain. I stepped back from the podium and gestured to Robert. "It is time for the audit presentation. The room is yours." As I walked toward the back of the room and leaving my family to deal with the fallout of their own actions, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear their world collapsing behind me as the truth began to bleed out of the ledgers and onto the boardroom table. They had wanted me to be their useful tool one last time. Instead, I was the one who would write the final entry in their history. I pushed open the double doors and stepped out into the hallway, walking away from the ruins of the empire they had failed to protect. For the first time, the path ahead was completely mine. Claire scrambled to regain control the moment the shock began to wear off. She slammed her hand flat against the heavy mahogany table, causing her expensive diamond bracelets to clatter loudly against the polished wood. "You are completely delusional," she snapped her voice, hitting a shrill, panicked pitch that echoed harshly off the boardroom walls. "We have a legally binding contract. You signed it. Your holding company signed it. We own the exclusive licensing rights to EcoBond, and no amount of your pathetic childhood resentment changes corporate law. Security is going to remove you from this building right now, and our legal team will handle the rest." I looked at her with pure clinical detachment. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to establish my authority in that room. I simply turned slightly to my left and gave my lead counsel, Robert, a single deliberate nod. Robert tapped the screen of the sleek tablet resting in his hands. The heavy velvet curtains at the far end of the boardroom instantly hummed to life, sliding shut automatically to block out the gray Seattle skyline. A massive digital projector descended silently from the ceiling, illuminating the front wall of the room with a stark high-definition glow. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly into the center of the brilliant light. "You are absolutely right, Claire," I said, my voice smooth and unyielding. "We do have a contract, and part of executing that specific contract required a mandatory mutual due diligence review of your internal corporate ledgers. Since you were arrogant enough to provide my office with completely unredacted access to your secure financial data rooms, I thought it would only be fair to share the actual results of my audit with your esteemed investors." The projection screen shifted. The first slide was a masterclass in forensic accounting. It displayed Hastings Manufacturing and its reported operating capital side by side with the actual hidden cash flow diversions I had painstakingly mapped out over the previous 4 weeks. "Let us discuss the vital concept of fiduciary duty," I announced to the silent, captivated room. "Over the past 36 months, your chief executive officer, the brilliant visionary sitting at the head of this very table, has systematically siphoned nearly $2 million out of your critical manufacturing budget." I clicked a small presentation remote in my hand. The screen transitioned to a complex web of intercepted bank transfers and shell company ownership records. I highlighted a recurring massive expense, $32,000 a month, consistently coded as strategic networking and client relations. I explained, pointing clearly to the red numbers. That money never went to client acquisition. It went directly to a ghost corporate entity that pays the lease on a 6,000 square foot luxury penthouse in downtown Portland. The primary and sole resident of that penthouse is Claire Hastings. Angry murmurs erupted instantly from the investors sitting around the table. Men and women in expensive business suits shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, pulling out their cell phones, their eyes darting rapidly between the damning evidence on the screen and my sister. Claire stood, entirely frozen, the color draining rapidly from her cheeks, leaving her looking pale and terrified. She opened her mouth to mount a defense, but I hid the remote again before she could form a single credible excuse. "We also have a custom-imported Porsche registered directly to Claire, cleverly buried under the research and development budget as an advanced mobility testing vehicle." I continued pacing slowly across the front of the room, letting every syllable land with maximum devastating impact. "And we absolutely cannot forget the $50,000 extracted from the Employee Wellness Fund, which actually paid for a 2-week private yacht charter in the Mediterranean. All of this occurred while the hard-working people on your factory floors were told there was simply no budget available for their annual safety bonuses. But the gross embezzlement of corporate funds is only half the story," I said, dropping my tone to a lethal serious register. I clicked the remote, and the screen flashed a brilliant warning red. It displayed a series of highly classified, heavily encrypted legal notices from the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. While Claire was eagerly financing a life of unchecked luxury, she ruthlessly slashed the factory safety compliance budgets by 80%. I looked directly at the primary venture capitalists who had been ready to fund this sinking ship. She ignored dozens of internal urgent memos from her own plant managers, warning her about toxic groundwater leakage and severe air quality violations. You investors were brought here today under the promise of a glorious global expansion. You were told your $30 million capital injection would fund a massive marketing campaign. That pitch was a complete and utter fabrication. I clicked the remote one final time, projecting the heavily stamped federal mandate for everyone to read. The EPA has issued a final uncompromising warning. Hastings Manufacturing has exactly 90 days to completely overhaul their chemical processing systems or face a forced federal shutdown of all operations. I let the silence hang for a moment before delivering the final blow. Your $30 million was never going toward global expansion. Claire was planning to secretly divert your incoming cash to pay off massive environmental fines, replace the stolen operating capital, and cover up her tracks before an independent federal receiver could discover her massive tax fraud. The boardroom exploded into absolute chaos. 3 of the primary venture capitalists jumped out of their leather chairs, shouting furiously across the table at Richard. They demanded immediate answers. They demanded their personal legal teams be brought in right away. The polished illusion of the untouchable Hastings empire was collapsing in real time, turning the previously dignified room into a theater of raw panic. Over the deafening roar of the furious investors, a piercing shriek shattered the noise. Patricia had finally found her voice. She lunged forward from her seat, pointing a trembling manicured finger directly at my face, her composure completely destroyed. "She's lying," my mother screamed, her voice cracking with pure unhinged desperation. "Do not listen to a single word this bitter, jealous girl says. She's a rejected outcast who has spent her entire miserable life resenting this family. She fabricated every single one of these documents to destroy her sister. She is sick. She is a liar. She would do absolutely anything to ruin us because we sent her away." I stood perfectly still, letting her vicious accusation echo off the walls and ring in the ears of the bewildered investors. I looked at the woman who had callously packed my entire childhood into 2 garbage bags. She was utterly cornered, relying on the exact same cruel tactics she had used 18 years ago to dismiss my worth. She fully expected me to shrink back. She expected me to defend myself against her maternal authority and start crying. Instead, I simply smiled. It was a cold, devastatingly calm smile. "I am an auditor, Patricia." I said, my voice easily cutting through the chaos in the room. "I do not deal in childhood resentment. I deal in receipts." I turned back to the angry investors, raising my hand to command their full attention once more. "My mother claims these financial documents are fabricated," I told them. "So let us not rely on my paperwork. Let us rely entirely on their own words." I signaled Robert again. He tapped the glowing screen of his tablet. The digital projection went dark instantly, replaced by a single pulsing audio waveform. I had spent 4 grueling weeks wearing a hidden wire to those secret strategic meetings in the downtown Seattle co-working space. Now the high-definition acoustic speakers built into the Hastings Manufacturing boardroom broadcasted the undeniable brutal truth to the very people they were trying to defraud. The audio playback was crystal clear. My father's deep, authoritative voice filled the room first. "The formula for EcoBond is stored on your company's servers. All we need you to do is copy the chemical formulations onto a flash drive and bring it to us. Consider it a consulting fee. You give us the flash drive, we give you $50,000. The investors gasped audibly. A collective shockwave ripped through the room as they realized the chief executive officer was caught on tape, explicitly ordering corporate espionage. But the recording was not finished. Claire's voice played next, arrogant, dismissive, and entirely unfiltered. "Nobody is going to prison. The firm you work for is a disorganized mess. They will not even notice someone accessed the files until we have already patented a slight variation of the formula under a different name. The venture capital investors are gullible sheep. Once we have their $30 million, we plug the holes in the ledger, pay off the environmental fines, and we walk away completely clean." Finally, Patricia's voice echoed through the high-end speakers, dripping with the sickening transactional affection I knew so well. "I knew you would do the right thing, sweetheart. You always were a smart girl when you applied yourself." The audio cut off sharply, leaving a ringing, agonizing silence in its wake. the trap had closed with a deafening, undeniable snap. There was absolutely nowhere left to hide. No amount of corporate public relations spin could ever erase the sound of their own voices actively plotting federal wire fraud, intellectual property theft, and massive investor deception. The lead investor, a stern older man who had been ready to write them a massive check just an hour ago, aggressively shoved his heavy chair back from the table. He looked at Richard with absolute unfiltered disgust, grabbed his leather briefcase, and pulled out his cell phone, muttering explicitly about contacting the federal authorities immediately. "It is over," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating air of the boardroom. Claire was gripping the edge of the mahogany table so hard, her knuckles were bone white. She looked like she was going to be physically sick right there on the floor. But her ego refused to let her surrender completely. She still clung desperately to the one thread of hope she thought she possessed. "You still signed the contract," she stammered, her voice shaking violently as she pointed a trembling finger at my briefcase. "We have the signed licensing agreement. It is fully executed. You cannot back out now. You gave us the rights to the patent." "Oh, I am not backing out, Claire," I said, taking slow, deliberate steps toward her end of the massive table. "I fully intend to enforce every single clause of the document you so eagerly signed yesterday afternoon. But perhaps you should have bothered to read page 27. I pulled a pristine copy of the executed contract from my leather portfolio and dropped it directly in front of her on the table. I watched her terrified eyes dart down to the heavy bond paper. In the world of high-stakes corporate acquisitions, Claire, we utilize a very specific legal mechanism to deal with hostile, unethical actors. I explained, letting my words wash over the remaining silent shareholders who were watching the execution with rapt attention. It is called a poison pill. You assumed I drafted a standard corporate shield to protect my holding company from your manufacturing liabilities. You were far too arrogant to actually read the dense, archaic language I spent 3 days meticulously constructing specifically for you. I reached out and pointed a perfectly steady finger at the exact paragraph on the page. Clause 7 explicitly states that the intellectual property transfer is entirely contingent upon the pristine financial health and ethical standing of the acquiring entity. It clearly dictates that if Hastings Manufacturing or any of its active executive officers are found to have engaged in any fraudulent activity, corporate embezzlement, undocumented capital diversion, or breach of fiduciary duty, prior to the signing of the agreement, the licensing transfer instantly converts into a massive debt instrument. Richard let out a strangled, horrifying gasp, his hands clutching his chest. The color completely left his face as he finally understood exactly what was happening. You were actively engaging in federal fraud and conspiracy to commit corporate theft. At the exact moment you willingly signed your names to this paper, I declared, my voice ringing with total, uncompromising authority, which means the poison pill has been officially triggered. Hastings Manufacturing has automatically defaulted on the contract. Claire stared at me, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly as tears of pure, unadulterated terror welled in her eyes. And the penalty for that default is absolute, I concluded, leaning over the table to ensure they felt the full crushing weight of my final judgment. Upon the discovery of your pre-existing financial misconduct, my holding firm immediately and irrevocably assumes full legal ownership of all commercial real estate listed under the Hastings Manufacturing portfolio as unencumbered collateral. That includes this entire corporate headquarters, the manufacturing plants in Ohio, and every single one of your distribution warehouses. The brutal reality hit them like a runaway freight train. Hastings Manufacturing was completely and irreversibly insolvent. They had absolutely no investors left. They were facing imminent federal indictments for wire fraud and embezzlement, and they had willingly signed away the physical foundation of their entire business empire to the very daughter they had treated like disposable trash. "I legally own the building you are standing in," I said, straightening my posture and looking down at the broken people who had abandoned me 18 years ago. "As of this exact moment, you have absolutely nothing left." The sheer weight of my declaration seemed to press the remaining oxygen out of the boardroom. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. The polished corporate executives, the venture capitalists, and my biological family all sat in a state of suspended animation. The massive digital projection behind me continued to glow with the undeniable documented proof of their massive financial crimes. Then the spell broke and the room descended into a masterclass of absolute corporate panic. The lead venture capitalist, a stern, silver-haired man who had spent the last hour nodding along to Richard's fabricated vision, stood up with such violent force that his heavy leather chair crashed backward into the glass wall. He did not bother to pick it up. He reached across the polished mahogany surface, snatched the multi-million-dollar term sheet they had been preparing to sign, and tore it straight down the middle. The sound of tearing thick parchment paper was the sharpest, loudest noise I had ever heard in that building. He looked at my father with a level of disgust, usually reserved for something you step on in the street. "You lied to us!" he barked, his voice shaking with furious indignation. "You sat there looking me dead in the eye and fed us a fairy tale while you were secretly bleeding out and dodging federal regulators. Do you have any idea what kind of fraud you just attempted to commit against my firm?" Richard opened his mouth to stammer an excuse, his hands raised in a desperate, placating gesture, but the investor was already pulling a sleek silver cell phone from his breast pocket. He did not want an apology. He wanted blood. "Save your breath, Richard," the investor said, turning his back on my father. "I am calling my legal team right now, and then I am personally calling the regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission. We are reporting this entire operation for attempted wire fraud. You will be lucky if you do not spend the rest of your natural life answering to federal prosecutors." The other board members and potential partners did not wait for a formal dismissal. They scrambled to gather their briefcases, their laptops, and their expensive wool coats. They moved with frantic, desperate energy, eager to put as much physical and legal distance as possible between themselves and the toxic wasteland of Hastings Manufacturing. They poured out of the double oak doors, leaving a chaotic trail of discarded pitch decks, spilled coffee, and shattered promises in their wake. As the heavy door swung shut behind the last fleeing investor, the reality of the situation finally seemed to penetrate Claire's pristine bubble of delusion. I watched her perfectly manicured hands begin to shake violently. She looked down at the damning audit projections, still glowing brightly on the massive presentation screen, and the final terrible math clicked into place inside her brain. For her entire life, Claire had operated under the absolute certainty that she was completely immune to consequences. She believed her expensive degrees, her flawless violin recitals, and her status as the favored golden child formed an impenetrable shield around her. But the federal government does not care about country club pedigrees or maternal favoritism. The federal government only cares about missing millions and paper trails. She looked at me, and the mask of the brilliant, arrogant executive completely dissolved. In its place was just a terrified 30-year-old woman who suddenly realized she was going to lose absolutely everything. The luxury penthouse in downtown Portland was gone. The imported sports car would be seized by federal agents. The Mediterranean yacht vacations were permanently over, but the loss of her material wealth was not what was making her hyperventilate. It was the realization of where she was going next. "Chloe, you have to fix this," Claire pleaded, her voice dropping into a high-pitched, raspy whine that sounded entirely childish. "You cannot give those files to the authorities. You cannot let them see the ledgers. They will audit my personal accounts. They will see the transfers to my boyfriend. They are going to charge me with embezzlement." I stood my ground looking at her without a single ounce of pity. "You charged yourself with embezzlement, Claire," I replied, my tone completely flat and analytical. "You stole $2 million from your own hard-working factory employees to fund a fake venture capital firm for your personal trainer. You bypassed critical safety regulations and actively poisoned your own factory grounds to pay for your luxury lifestyle. I did not force you to do any of that. I simply gathered the receipts. The federal authorities will decide what happens to you next." She let out a loud, gut-wrenching sob, wrapping her arms tightly around her stomach, as if she might be physically sick right there on the carpet. "I am going to go to federal prison," she wailed, her perfect posture crumbling as she sank down until her forehead hit the polished wood of the boardroom table. "I am going to lose my freedom. I cannot survive in a prison cell, Chloe. You have to stop them." Patricia was sitting 2 chairs away, completely paralyzed by the unfolding catastrophe. My mother had spent her entire adult life meticulously cultivating an image of flawless aristocratic success. She measured her absolute worth by the designer labels on her clothing and the jealous admiration of her peers. Now she was staring at an immediate future where her name would be splashed across the front page of local business journals under bold headlines detailing massive corporate fraud. "We have no money left," Patricia whispered, her eyes wide and vacant, staring at the torn term sheet resting in the center of the table. "If you trigger that clause, Chloe, if you take the real estate, where are we supposed to go? We used the house as collateral for the last round of factory loans. If the company is insolvent, the bank will foreclose on our home. We will have absolutely nothing." I looked at the woman who had coldly packed my childhood into black garbage bags. I remembered the exact shade of her crisp tennis outfit on the day she told me I was too expensive to keep around. "You will simply have to adapt, Patricia," I said, offering her the exact same cold, practical advice she had given me 18 years ago. "I hear that building resilience builds character. You should probably start looking for a modest apartment." The loss of the company, the loss of their wealth, and the impending criminal charges finally broke the man who had ruled our family with an iron fist. Richard Hastings, the intimidating patriarch, the man who never apologized and never looked back physically, gave out. He stumbled out from behind his heavy leather chair. His knees hit the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud. He was actually kneeling. The man who had thrown me out into a strange, gritty neighborhood with a single manila folder was now kneeling on the floor of the boardroom that I legally owned. He looked up at me, and his eyes were red-rimmed and desperate. The arrogant superiority was completely gone, replaced by the pathetic whimpering of a man who realized he had just destroyed his entire universe. "Chloe, please," he begged, reaching out a trembling hand toward the hem of my tailored suit. "You cannot do this to us. We will give you whatever you want. We will make you a full partner in the firm. We will give you 50% of everything once we restructure the debt. Just tear up the contract. Withdraw the fraud report. Please just let us walk away." I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. I felt no burning anger. I felt no lingering sadness. I just felt the quiet, empty space where a father should have been. "You have nothing left to offer me, Richard," I said, my voice echoing cleanly through the massive empty room. "I do not need 50% of a bankrupt, toxic liability. I already own the buildings, the land, the factory equipment, and the patent. You possess absolutely no leverage." He crawled forward an inch, tears finally spilling over his wrinkled cheeks and dropping onto his expensive silk tie. "We are family," he cried, his voice breaking into a ragged, desperate sob. "We are your mother and father. Claire is your own twin sister. You cannot just destroy us like this. You cannot throw us out into the street to fend for ourselves. We share the same blood, Chloe. You have to show us mercy. We are blood." That word hung in the stale boardroom air. Blood. They loved to use that word when it served their financial needs. They loved to weaponize family loyalty only when they were the ones extracting the benefits. I looked at Richard kneeling on the floor, looking up at me with pathetic, hopeful eyes. I looked at Patricia staring blankly at the wall, mourning her lost social status. I looked at Claire, sobbing uncontrollably into her arms, terrified of the prison sentence she had entirely earned. I thought about Uncle Thomas. I thought about the cheap black coffee, the towering stacks of financial ledgers, and the profound unconditional belief he had placed in a discarded 11-year-old girl. He had taught me that true loyalty is proven through consistent actions, not genetics. He had taught me that boundaries are not cruel, they are simply the architecture of self-respect. I took one deliberate step back, carefully removing myself from Richard's desperate reaching hand. I looked down at him, ensuring he saw the absolute finality in my eyes, and I delivered the absolute final truth. "You legally severed our blood 18 years ago to save money," I said, my voice striking the quiet room like a heavy wooden gavel closing a case. "You signed away your parental rights on a sagging porch because you decided I was a bad investment. You threw me away. I am not destroying your family, Richard. I am just balancing the ledger." I did not wait for a response. I did not need to hear another desperate plea or another fabricated apology. I turned my back on the three of them. I signaled to Robert and Sarah, who were standing quietly by the doors waiting for my command. "Let us go," I said, adjusting the strap of my leather portfolio. "Our business here is completely concluded. I walked down the length of the massive mahogany table, my heels clicking with the same steady rhythmic pace I had used when I entered. I pushed through the heavy oak double doors and stepped out into the quiet, brightly lit hallway. Behind me, I could hear the muffled sounds of Richard weeping and Claire hyperventilating, the noises of a crumbling dynasty fading into the background where they belonged. I walked straight to the elevator bank and pressed the call button. The polished steel door slid open instantly. I stepped inside, flanked by my attorneys, and turned around to face the hallway. As the door slowly glided shut, closing off the last view of the Hastings Manufacturing Executive Suite, I felt a massive invisible weight lift completely off my shoulders. I had not just survived the trauma they inflicted on me, I had meticulously quantified it, audited it, and billed them for the absolute maximum penalty allowed by reality. The terrified girl, who had been thrown away in garbage bags, was gone. The CEO had successfully collected her debts. The storm clouds over Seattle were finally breaking, and for the first time in 18 years, the path forward belonged entirely to me. 6 months have passed since the heavy mahogany doors of the Hastings boardroom swung shut behind me for the final time. Time is a peculiar and fascinating thing. When you are trapped in the dark shadow of childhood trauma, the days stretch into an endless, agonizing marathon. Every single hour feels like an impossible burden to carry. But when you are finally holding the pen that writes your own future, time moves with a brisk, purposeful, and beautiful rhythm. Today, the Seattle rain is tapping gently against the large, thick window of my corner office, but the gray clouds outside no longer mirror the atmosphere inside. The suffocating tension that once defined this building has been entirely scrubbed clean. The air is clear, and the future is entirely mine. Let us talk about the golden child first. Claire Hastings built her entire existence on the absolute unshakable belief that she was completely untouchable. She believed with every fiber of her being that the rules of society were written only for ordinary people and that her expensive wardrobe, her flawless smiles, and her Ivy League pedigree granted her a permanent lifetime exemption from consequences. That beautiful, sparkling illusion shattered into a million pieces the exact moment the federal investigators seized her corporate hard drives. The audio recordings from our covert meetings in that downtown co-working space were the final undeniable nail in her meticulously manicured coffin. She is currently sitting in a cold holding facility, awaiting trial under a sweeping and massive federal indictment. The charges brought against her by the government are extensive, ranging from massive wire fraud and aggressive corporate embezzlement to a deliberate, calculated conspiracy to commit intellectual property theft. The luxury penthouse overlooking the river in downtown Portland, the one she secretly funded with stolen factory operating capital, was promptly seized by the federal government to help satisfy the staggering mountain of financial restitution she owes. Her custom-imported sports car was towed away and auctioned off to the highest bidder. The sunny Mediterranean yacht charters and exclusive VIP parties are a distant, fading memory now. They have been completely replaced by endless, depressing meetings with court-appointed public defenders who constantly have to remind her that the digital evidence is completely insurmountable. She tried to play the innocent victim, of course. During her initial arraignment, she actually tried to cry in front of the federal judge, blaming the immense pressure of the family business and the unfair expectations of our parents. But the judge simply listened to the audio tape of her laughing about defrauding gullible venture capitalists and denying safety equipment to factory workers. He looked down at her from the bench and denied her request for a lenient bail arrangement. She is facing a very significant mandatory prison sentence, and for the very first time in her 30 years of privileged life, there is absolutely no one left to write a massive check to make her problems disappear. And then there are my parents. Richard and Patricia Hastings spent their entire adult lives constructing a fragile, towering monument to their own vanity and greed. They measured their human worth entirely by the square footage of their real estate, their elite country club memberships, and the envious glances of their wealthy social circle. When the massive scale of Claire's embezzlement and the devastating environmental fines became public knowledge, that delicate house of cards collapsed with terrifying, incredible speed. Because they had willingly and arrogantly signed the poison pill contract while actively engaged in a criminal conspiracy, they legally forfeited every single commercial asset they possessed to my holding firm. But the financial bleeding did not stop at the corporate level. The banks immediately panicked and called in the massive personal loans my parents had recklessly secured using their private mansion as collateral. Their eager creditors swarmed like angry locusts demanding immediate payment. Within 90 days, the great Richard and Patricia Hastings were forced into the humiliating position of declaring total personal bankruptcy. The sprawling, beautiful estate with the manicured green lawns and the grand dining room where they used to cruelly mock my lack of ambition was officially foreclosed upon and sold by the bank. They now live in a cramped, dark two-bedroom apartment on the extreme industrial outskirts of the city. It is a depressing, rundown complex with peeling grey paint, noisy, clanking radiators, and a bleak view of a cracked concrete parking lot. It is the exact kind of impoverished, gritty environment they were so absolutely terrified of that they abandoned their own 11-year-old daughter to avoid it. The sheer poetic justice of their current reality is almost too perfect to put into simple words. They have no money, no status, no influence, and no friends. The elite society, they sacrificed my childhood to impress, completely abandoned them the moment the fraud scandal hit the local evening news. They sit alone in that tiny apartment surrounded by the crushing, deafening silence of their own terrible choices. They do not call me to ask for help. They know better now. They know the ledger between us is permanently and irreversibly closed. While they were busy reaping the bitter, awful harvest of their own boundless greed, I was incredibly busy rebuilding the industrial empire they had nearly driven into the ground. Taking over a massive manufacturing plant on the absolute brink of federal closure was a monumental logistical challenge. But I am a trained auditor, and I know exactly how to fix broken, failing systems. The very first thing I did was march directly down to the main factory floor in Ohio. The workers there were understandably terrified. They had read the alarming newspaper headlines, and they fully expected the new corporate ownership to liquidate the heavy machinery, lay everyone off without severance, and sell the scrap metal for a quick, heartless profit. That is exactly what a typical greedy holding firm would do. But I stood on a wooden shipping crate in the middle of that cavernous, loud warehouse, looking out at the hundreds of men and women in yellow hard hats and scratched safety goggles, and I made them a solemn, unwavering promise. I told them that not a single person was losing their livelihood. I told them that the toxic, negligent leadership was gone forever, and that we were going to build something entirely new and prosperous together. I immediately injected clean, legitimate capital from my primary holding firm to completely overhaul the dangerous chemical processing and air filtration systems. We easily satisfied the Environmental Protection Agency requirements and successfully halted the federal shutdown procedures in a matter of weeks. We safely and legally integrated the brilliant EcoBond patent into the main assembly line, transforming a toxic environmental nightmare into the premier, eco-friendly, industrial, adhesive manufacturing facility on the entire market. The factory floor that Claire had intentionally starved of basic safety equipment was entirely modernized and cleaned. We instituted comprehensive worker protection protocols, generous hazard pay, and fair profit-sharing initiatives that rewarded the people actually doing the labor. The morale shifted almost overnight from fear to genuine pride. Then came my favorite moment of the entire transition. I ordered a specialized construction crew to remove the giant glowing Hastings manufacturing sign from the front of the corporate headquarters. Watching the heavy crane lower those massive metal letters to the ground felt like watching a dark, oppressive storm finally break apart and scatter into the wind. In its place, we raised a brand new sign forged in clean, bright brushed steel. It reads, Thomas Industrial Solutions. I proudly named the newly restructured corporation after the only man who ever truly acted like a real father to me. Uncle Thomas did not leave me a massive empire of money when he passed away. He left me something infinitely more valuable and enduring. He left me a solid framework for personal integrity, a relentless, disciplined work ethic, and the profound, unshakable knowledge that my worth was never dictated by the cruel people who threw me away. Every single time I walk past the main lobby and see his name gleaming brightly on the polished wall, I feel a deep, abiding sense of joy. I took the shattered, ruined remnants of a corrupt family business and turned it into an honest industry leader that actually respects the working people who do the heavy lifting. Yesterday afternoon, I took a rare and quiet break from the busy office. The Seattle air was crisp, cold, and carried the faint, pleasant, salty scent of the Puget Sound. I drove out to the quiet, green, peaceful cemetery where Uncle Thomas is buried. I did not bring expensive, elaborate floral arrangements. Thomas always hated unnecessary, frivolous spending. Instead, I brought a simple paper cup of dark roast black coffee and a freshly printed copy of our latest highly profitable quarterly earnings report. I sat down on the slightly damp grass next to his modest grey headstone, and I just talked to him. I told him all about the massive factory upgrades and the new safety protocols. I told him about the impressive new environmental certifications we had just secured from the state board. I told him that the terrified, crying little girl he had taken in all those years ago on that rainy night was officially gone forever. In her place was a strong, capable woman who knew exactly how to calculate the true cost of a lie and the immeasurable, enduring value of the absolute truth. I sat there in the peaceful, tranquil silence of the cemetery, listening to the gentle wind rustling through the leaves of the old oak trees, and I realized something truly miraculous. The heavy, suffocating stone of trauma that had sat painfully on my chest for 18 long years had completely evaporated into the atmosphere. I did not just barely survive the cruelty of my biological parents. I had utterly conquered it. I had taken the absolute worst hand a vulnerable child could possibly be dealt, and I had played it into a magnificent masterpiece of justice and redemption. I traced the deeply engraved letters of Thomas's name on the cool, rough granite stone, and I whispered a final heartfelt thank you into the breeze. The ledger was finally perfectly and beautifully balanced. If you are listening to this story right now, and you are currently carrying the heavy, agonizing weight of a family that constantly makes you feel like you are difficult, unworthy, or unloved, I desperately need you to hear this truth. Love is never a simple transaction, and you do absolutely not have to accept cruelty, neglect, or abuse just because it comes wrapped in the familiar word family. You have the absolute total power to set your own firm boundaries, to write your own life contracts, and to build a towering, beautiful empire out of the very stones they maliciously threw at you. You are not a burden to the world. You are simply waiting to fully discover your own incredible strength. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this long emotional journey. If my story resonated with you in any way or gave you a spark of hope, please take a quick moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps these important stories reach the exact people who need to hear them the most right now. Please drop a comment below and let me know exactly where you are watching from today and what time it is there right now. I absolutely love connecting with this amazing supportive community from all over the world. Remember, your human worth is never determined by the people who blindly walk away from you. Your worth is proudly built by the incredible strength you find when you finally decide to stand on your own 2 feet. Take wonderful care of yourselves out there, and I will see you in the next story. When you finally step out of the dark shadow cast by the people who were supposed to protect you, the light can feel almost blinding. It takes time for your eyes to adjust to the reality that you are actually free. For a very long time, I sat in the quiet moments of my life and tried to make sense of the profound cruelty I had endured. I would look at the clean lines of my office, the healthy balance sheets of my company, and the peaceful life I had meticulously built, and I would still feel the phantom ache of that 11-year-old girl standing on a cold porch with garbage bags holding all her worldly possessions. Trauma is not something you simply pack away in a neat little box and forget about. It is a landscape you must learn to navigate. It requires you to map out your own emotional terrain, to understand where the pitfalls are, and to actively choose to build your house on solid ground instead of the quicksand of someone else's approval. For 18 years, I believed that because my parents did not want me, I was inherently worthless. That is the most insidious and destructive lie a toxic family can plant inside the mind of a child. When the people who brought you into this world look at you and decide you do not hold enough value to keep you internalize that rejection as a fundamental flaw in your own design, You grow up walking through the world constantly, apologizing for the space you take up. You learn to speak quietly, to demand nothing, and to bend yourself into agonizing shapes just to avoid being an inconvenience. You convince yourself that if you're simply good enough, quiet enough, or successful enough, you might magically unlock the conditional love they have been withholding. You treat your own self-esteem as a debt you constantly have to pay off. But I learned a magnificent and unshakable truth during my journey. A bad investment to the wrong people is an absolute goldmine in the right hands. My biological parents looked at a quiet, thoughtful girl and saw a liability. They saw someone who did not fit into their loud, flashy, and fundamentally corrupt narrative. They wanted a mirror that would reflect their own vanity back to them, and when I failed to be that mirror, they discarded me to balance their social ledger. But they failed to understand that the very traits they despised, my quiet observation, my analytical mind, my absolute refusal to participate in their shallow illusions, were the exact tools I needed to conquer the world. They threw away a diamond because they were too ignorant to recognize anything that was not coated in cheap plastic glitter. When you find yourself in the hands of people who truly value integrity over appearance, everything changes. Uncle Thomas saw the goldmine in me. He did not ask me to perform. He did not ask me to be a perfectly polished accessory for his country club dinners. He simply handed me a ledger and taught me how to read the truth. He watered the roots they had tried to pull from the ground, and in doing so, he taught me the most vital lesson of my entire existence. Blood does not entitle anyone to your future, your peace, or your hard-earned assets. We are constantly bombarded by a society that tells us family is the most important thing in the world. We are told that we must always forgive, always forget, and always leave the door open for the people who share our genetics. We are fed this romanticized narrative that parental love is universally pure and that any fracture in a family dynamic must surely be the result of a simple misunderstanding. But those of us who have actually survived the calculated cruelty of narcissistic parents know that this is a dangerous and damaging myth. Toxic families use the concept of blood as a weapon. They use it as a heavy chain to keep you bound to their dysfunction. When they have exhausted every other avenue of manipulation, when their lies are exposed and their empires are crumbling, they will inevitably drop to their knees and invoke the sacred bond of family. They will look at the child they abused, neglected, or abandoned and demand unearned loyalty simply because of a biological accident. They will expect you to sacrifice your mental health, your financial stability, and your personal joy to shield them from the consequences of their own terrible choices. But you do not owe them your destruction just because they gave you your DNA. You do not owe a lifeline to the people who gladly watched you drown. The moment my father knelt on the floor of my boardroom and begged for mercy, invoking the blood we shared, he fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the transaction. He had legally and morally severed that blood tie 18 years prior to save a few dollars on his bottom line. He treated my existence as a purely financial equation. I simply learned his language and balanced the equation perfectly. This brings me to you, the person sitting on the other side of this screen, listening to my story. I know exactly why you clicked on this video. I know the heavy, invisible burden you carry with you every single day. If you have ever been the designated scapegoat of your family, you know exactly what I am talking about. You know the profound, exhausting loneliness of sitting at a holiday dinner table and feeling like an absolute stranger among the people who have known you your entire life. You know the unique, agonizing pain of watching your parents pour endless resources, affection, and praise into a golden child while you are left to scavenge for basic emotional survival. You have endured the gaslighting, the constant shifting of blame, and the terrifying realization that your reality is constantly being rewritten to protect their fragile egos. The family scapegoat is always the strongest person in the room. They target you precisely because you have the profound ability to see the truth that they are desperately trying to hide. You are the whistleblower in a house built on lies. Your very existence makes them uncomfortable because you refuse to fully submit to the false narrative. They punish you because your integrity threatens their illusion. If you have ever had to build your own worth from the absolute ground up using nothing but your own grit and determination, I want you to take a moment to recognize the sheer magnitude of your own power. You did not have a safety net. You did not have cheering section. You had to become your own parent, your own protector, and your own biggest advocate. You had to lay every single brick of your foundation with your own bare hands while fighting off the people who kept trying to knock the walls down. Do not ever let anyone diminish the incredible, magnificent life you have constructed from the ruins they left behind. Your success is not a happy accident. It is the direct result of your relentless refusal to be destroyed. You turned your deep, agonizing trauma into purpose. You turned their rejection into your ultimate motivation. This is why we must talk about the vital, absolute importance of setting strict boundaries. Boundaries are not acts of revenge. They are not cruel punishments designed to hurt the people who wronged you. Boundaries are your personal armor. They are the protective walls you build around your hard-earned peace to ensure that toxic, hostile forces can never invade your sanctuary again. You must never apologize for wearing your armor. When a family member tells you that you are being unreasonable or cold for cutting contact, they are simply mourning the loss of their favorite target. When they accuse you of holding a grudge, they are trying to manipulate you into dropping your shield so they can strike you again. Do not listen to their desperate hollow noise. You have the absolute supreme right to decide who gets access to your energy, your time, and your life. If someone repeatedly proves that they cannot handle your heart with care, you have the moral obligation to take it away from them entirely. I want to create a space here for the people who understand this specific kind of survival. The healing journey is incredibly long and often feels incredibly isolating, but you do not have to walk it completely alone. We draw immense power from hearing each other speak the truth out loud. We gather profound strength when we realize our deepest, darkest experiences are shared by thousands of other brave, resilient souls across the world. I want to hear from you. I want to read the words you have been holding back for years. Drop your story in the comments below. Tell me about the moment you finally realized you were not the broken one in your family. Tell me about the specific day you packed your bags, walked out the door, and decided to choose yourself. Share the incredible things you have built, the peace you have found, and the boundaries you have fiercely maintained. Your story might be the exact validation someone else desperately needs to read today. It might be the catalyst that gives another scapegoat the courage to finally stand up and walk away from their abusers. While you are down there sharing your beautiful, powerful journey, let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. There is something deeply comforting about knowing that we are all connected across different time zones, different continents, and different backgrounds, united by a shared resilience. Whether you are watching this with your morning coffee in London, sitting in the quiet midnight hours in Sydney, or taking a lunch break in Chicago, your presence here matters immensely to me. If my journey from a discarded, frightened child to a victorious, empowered CEO resonated with you, if it sparked a fire in your chest or gave you a much-needed sense of validation, please hit that like button. It is a small gesture, but it sends a massive signal that these stories of justice are important and necessary. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue to build this incredible community of survivors together. We have so many more stories to share. Stories of people who face impossible odds, confront devastating family betrayal, and rise from the ashes stronger and more brilliant than before. We will continue to shine a bright and forgiving light on the toxic dynamics that thrive in silence, and we will continue to celebrate the incredible beauty of living a life built on absolute truth. The path forward is entirely yours to command. You hold the pen, you control the ledger, and you possess the ultimate authority to deny entry to anyone who attempts to drag their toxic baggage into your peaceful domain. The people who abandoned you do not get to dictate the altitude of your flight. Until next time, stand tall in the magnificent life you have built. Guard your peace with the ferocity of a warrior defending a sacred temple. And above all else, always and forever, know your true enduring worth.